Oh, and we see Professor Igo, but not her camera. Just her.
It takes about a minute for all the attendees to sort of flood in, but we are live.
Okay.
Hi, guys.
And we want Professor Igo to have her camera on, right? Do we need to tell her to turn her camera on?
Michelle can fix that.
Okay. Are we live?
We're live.
Hey, folks. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Jules Polonetsky at the Future of Privacy Forum. I'm here with Stacy Gray, one of our policy counsel, Michelle Bay, who's behind the camera, hopefully making the stream nicely to all of you. We've got a couple of people remote, and we have a couple of people in the room, and then lots of you virtually who, as you know, when we after we hear a bit from our author, Professor Igo, and start the chat here in the room, we'll look to bring you in so that you can share your pearls of wisdom and your comments as well. Let me ask our remote people, since we've got more remote people, so some of our remote representatives, let me ask them to join. Oh, I see Professor Igo is in the house, is in the room. Professor Igo, can you hear us? Well, we see her, but hope, can you hear? I see our camera. Can you hear us? We don't hear you.
We'll give it a second. I think probably the microphone's coming online.
Okay, it takes a little.
I can hear you.
There you go. Thanks.
All right.
So sorry for the technical difficulties.
Welcome, Professor. So I'm going to have our co-hosts, co-panelists here in our book club introduce themselves. I'm going to start with the remote folks, then the people in the room here with me, and then we'll turn to you. Sandra, you're calling in. You're online from Paris.
Yes. Hi, everyone. So I'm Sandra. I'm from Paris, France. I'm a French lawyer. I'm specialized in IP, IT, and of course, a lot about data privacy.
Super. And Shoshana?
Shoshana Rosenberg. I'm an in-house assistant general counsel, but I'm also our global chief privacy officer for a professional services firm. And I've spent 11 years in privacy, and it only gets more exciting every day.
Okay, so we have New York, Paris, and then we have from London, but physically in the room.
I'm Gabe Maldoff. I'm an associate at Bird & Bird, where I do privacy and data protection stuff in London, as Jules mentioned.
And jumping across the table, also from London.
Yes, I'm actually just over the road.
Yeah.
So my name's Guy Cohen. I work for a company called Privatar. So that is a privacy engineering company, and we build privacy enhancing technologies.
Awesome. And the camera is there, so you can look at me because I like being looked at. But our audience also is out there. Ed, welcome.
Thanks. I'm Kay McInnes. I work for Consumer Reports Advocacy on privacy and technology issues, and I'm based here in Washington, D.C.
Professor Igo, let's, Stacey, go ahead. Sorry, I introduced you at the top.
Yeah.
Exactly, I did. But
yes. But for those people who are just joining, I'm Stacy Gray. I'm a policy counsel here at Future Privacy Forum in Washington, D.C.
And one of the people who makes all the good things here happen. So.
And should we do a couple housekeeping things before we turn it over to Professor Igo? Just for those of us who are joining us remotely, welcome. Hi. And so by default, your microphones and videos are turned off, but we would really welcome your participation, particularly a little bit later in the hour. And the way to do that is to use the raising hand function on the Zoom platform, or to shoot us a message in the chat function using the Zoom platform. And we will upgrade you to panelist, which will enable your microphone and video, and you can join into the conversation. You're also welcome to just use the chat function if you'd prefer to do that. But yeah, we'd really welcome people jumping in and participating. So that's the housekeeping.
Super. So there are 44 of you out there remotely, so welcome. We really want to make sure this works as much for the virtual people, since many of you perhaps have in-person book clubs. I used to have an in-person privacy book club, and the theory here was that there are lots of interests and attitudes around the world, and if this is a nice way to help make the conversation easy, we want to make that happen. So, so glad to have Professor Igo with us. Professor, we're going to ask you to tell us why you wrote this book, and hear some of your thoughts, and I'll have a couple of questions for you, but we'll ask you sort of to open with, what brought you to this. This is not a traditional, law of privacy book, which is probably why a lot of people on this call who are law or privacy practitioners really appreciated it, since it kind of helped, I think, many of us round out, some of the things that we deal with in a day-to-day way and see the unique history of privacy in America. I was worried, since we try to do this internationally, that it would be U.S.-centric, because it is a U.S.-centric book. And I can tell you that the global people that I've run into around the world have told me how much they actually appreciated it, and how it added nuance. So hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that from our friends from the UK, Paris, or those who are remote. So let me, and after we chat with you, we're going to let you go about your day and grade your students' finals and things like that, and turn it over to the book club people who usually get to talk about what they thought. So anyway, opening thoughts. I have loved it. I've been dog-earing it. It's perfect for people like us who spend.
Hold this up. Gotta hold this up for people.
Perfect for people who spend their days dealing with data protection and don't all have the cultural perspective, the literary perspective. What brought you to sort of go across all these different disciplines to pull together culture and history, feminist theory, so many of the other areas that you touch on? What motivated this book?
I will answer that. I'll try to answer that, but let me just make sure that you can hear me and see me okay. I was having some technical problems. Okay, great. And also, I really wanted to thank you, Jules, for organizing this wonderful forum and for inviting me to be part of it. I'm really pleased, and thanks to Michelle Bay too for logistics. So I want to say one thing at the very outset, which is, this is the Future of Privacy Forum, and I write about the past. So I've really been engaged in thinking about the past of privacy rather than what's coming. Although, of course, as a historian, I have to believe that knowing something about the past helps us think about the future, and certainly about our contemporary moment of privacy debates and crisis and so forth. I was thinking about this book, obviously, and researching it for a long time before Cambridge Analytica, but that's right around the moment when the book came out. And it's clear, I think, that we need a history of how we got to this crazy place that we're in. So what brought me to write about privacy, I suppose, was recognizing that while privacy seems to me very present in American public culture, it actually seems like it's really at the core of so many debates in American society, that historians hadn't really written about it in that way. They had taken up discrete legal debates, or they had looked at kind of jurisprudential developments, but they hadn't really thought about why it was that Americans started talking about and fixating on privacy in the 20th century. And what that might reveal to us about the society that we live in. So I really would date our modern conversations about privacy to the late 19th century for a whole host of political and technological, social developments, and would argue that Americans haven't really stopped arguing about privacy since then, and that to understand how we arrived at that place, we need to understand the kind of society that was taking shape. And so at some point, I don't know, midway through writing this book, I hit upon this formulation of a knowing society, that we live in a society that seeks to know us better, more rigorously, in a more fine-grained way, in all kinds of different domains. And that it is our status as known citizens, whether willingly or unwillingly, that has generated many, probably not all, but many of the privacy debates that we are so familiar with today. And that those started longer ago than we usually think about. And I would really, again, date that in the late 19th century and say that we really started thinking about privacy in a new way in the late 19th century. For complex reasons, some of them technological, some of them having to do with new kinds of citizenship claims and entitlements people thought they should have, partly because of the virtualization of worries about privacy that happened, by which I mean people weren't just thinking about property lines, they were starting to think about photography and image and starting to think about interior matters and how they could be accessed by outsiders. They started later thinking about data and personal information, and all these things started to collect under the banner of privacy and mean that while we sometimes think privacy is disappearing, in fact, the claims about privacy have in a way been expanding. There's more and more kinds of topics that have fit under privacy and have been fought for under the heading of privacy. And that this starts to explain, doesn't totally answer, but starts to explain why we have so many tensions in contemporary American culture around privacy matters. And I want to emphasize that, these are debates that occur at the level of state, kinds of infringements of privacy, but they're also really everywhere else too, in the realm of media, medicine, social research, architecture, you name it, and you can find privacy debates kind of popping up all over in the 20th century. So is that enough of an overview? And I'd love to hear people's questions or thoughts about this long history of privacy and what it might suggest about today's landscape.
One of the stories that is probably familiar to most people who work in privacy is sort of the origins of the Brandeis article and the reaction to Kodakers and cameras in public places. But what I particularly enjoyed were so many of these other morsels that are usually not, out in public discussion, particularly the way you trace the reactions to the social security number and how people reacted to that. But were there, are any of the other sort of anecdotal sort of historical situations here that you found particularly interesting or telling? The Social Security one I found was just so rich because of how many different ways the initial reaction was not necessarily to an identifier, was to the women who were worried about their employer, their status. But do you have a favorite sort of story situation or two that you thought was a real strong morsel that helped illustrate some of the issues?
Yeah, sure. Well, Social Security would definitely be one of them. I was so surprised, and it tells you something, I guess, about our mindset in the 21st century. I was so surprised to find, in looking at the public reaction to Social Security numbers, so much less concern about privacy than I was expecting. That people really wanted, in some sense, to be identified and known by the state in order to access benefits. So that story became very interesting to me in thinking about the kind of zigs and zags in how personal identification and personal information have played into questions and debates over privacy, right? That they haven't always played in the same way. And my very reaction as a 21st century citizen to the idea that people would publicize their Social Security numbers or have them engraved on bronze plates or tattooed on their bodies was very surprising, and shows that actually privacy is a really malleable concept, that our ideas about it have changed, and they've changed in dialogue with state practices, with our sense of trust in the institutions that house our information, and all kinds of other things. Another episode that I found really fascinating was the very, very sudden shift in attitudes around research subjects' privacy in the 1960s and 1970s. And so I got really fascinated by this case of Laud Humphreys, who was a pioneering sociologist who spied on men in the act of having sex in public restrooms, and was applauded by his colleagues until suddenly people started worrying about the privacy of the men he was observing, even though they were engaged in practices which were illegal, certainly condemned sort of by official society, and were, not at all countenanced in kind of public discourse, and yet their privacy suddenly became an issue of really important concern in terms of research ethics in the late 60s and early 70s. So looking at some of those really fast shifts or pivots in how people thought about privacy, I found really useful, because so much of our contemporary ways of talking about privacy assume that we all know what it is, or that we used to have it and we don't anymore, or that people have been busy taking it away or giving it away, but they don't stop and think actually what the content is of that and how it's changed and how our sensibilities have changed, sometimes quite rapidly. And I do think that's what a historical perspective offers us, that while I was tracing the history of privacy, that was a moving target all the way from the late 19th century to the present, and is of course still undergoing all kinds of changes as we speak, as we try to think through our own boundaries and our own rights on new technological platforms, or in new political circumstances, or given new social behaviors.
I know you've been giving some book talks to sort of technology, privacy type audiences. I know Michelle, were you at Fordham, I think, where you heard at NYU. But I imagine you're also, as you're out on the book tour type circuit, you're presumably talking to other groups, broader groups, general groups, literary groups. Do you see a difference between sort of the reception in the privacy geeks of the world, the tech policy, people of the world, like all of us, and the humans of the world, or the people coming from different disciplines? Is there are people just generally appreciating it in the same way, or are you getting, different reactions from different kinds of audiences that are interesting?
I do consider all of you humans, I should say, to begin with. But I really love talking to a group like this, where there's so much expertise and so much kind of working knowledge of privacy regulations and the kind of the fine points. But it's also really interesting to talk to people who just assume, that we're in a crisis mode and this is brand new. And so I've had a lot of fun talking to alumni groups and just general audiences who are really surprised often to hear that this debate we've been having is more than 100 years old, and has some very, even in the late 19th century, has a kind of resonance for us. People worrying about, photographers circulating their image without their permission, and what would happen to their image once it, got into the mix of commerce, or could be preserved and sent around without the image holder's knowledge. So I think the reactions have been really all over the place, which doesn't surprise me, because the topic lends itself to so many different conversations. It's one of the things that made it really hard to try to write a book about privacy, I'll say, especially one that tried to not just look at the technological aspects, or not just the legal aspects, or not just the cultural aspects, or not just the kind of built environment aspects, but tried to look at them all. I'm not sure ultimately how successful I was in doing that, but it seemed important to me, because these questions about privacy do touch on so many different aspects of modern life. In fact, they are a kind of undercurrent of most of our, I came to think, anyway, most of the debates that we have some privacy component. And so, I think people enter into this discussion from wherever they are, and whatever aspect of privacy is most dominant for them. For parents, it's often their kids' social media use, right? But for people really concerned with reproductive rights, it's about, what's going to happen in the United States with a conservative administration. So yeah, the reactions have been lovely in their range. And every conversation I have, makes me think, oh, and that was something I should have talked more about in this book, but it's already plenty long, as you know.
Question for many of you guys?
Yeah, so I was wondering, there's a couple moments in your book where you chart the progress of like an anti-knowing or like a privacy protective movement that's driven by mobilization. And we see that especially in the Social Security context, where that effort actually drove it to like a kind of unexpected end to have paper Social Security cards, despite the fact that that wasn't as durable as it could have been. And I was just wondering if you think that social movements have been effective. I mean, you mentioned them a couple times over the course of your book, but it's not the major through line. And then the second part of that question is, do you think there's a possibility for mobilization to engender some sort of new understanding of privacy in modern day America with this confessional culture that we have?
Those are great questions. And I've been thinking about them a lot, actually, because I do think, of course, that social movements are important and that they make a difference. And yet it becomes a little bit difficult to find really key moments in the last 100 years where citizens' protests over a presumed breach of a public-private line has had lasting consequences. I mean, there certainly are ways in which citizens' movements and social protests have been important. One of them I can think of right off the bat is that proposals in the early 20th century for a national fingerprint database, for example, never materialized because of the close association between fingerprinting and criminality. So J. Edgar Hoover wants a database of fingerprints and he doesn't get them, in part because of a really strong societal reaction to that plan. You could question whether that has held, right? We use our fingerprints for all kinds of things now these days, often semi-voluntarily, right? I did to open my computer today. So it's not clear that line in the sand, really held, but in certain ways, a national data bank in the United States, which was proposed in the late 60s and early 70s, did not take hold again because of popular protests and opposition from Congress and journalists, but also citizens. Privacy legislation has been powered. You could think of FERPA, the Family Educational Privacy Act around school records, or the Privacy Act of 1974 have been powered by, real grassroots, sometimes movements. So I do think those are powerful. They sometimes can have some unexpected effects. I think a lot of times the reading of public sensitivities around things, whether it's social security numbers and official documentation or citizens' resistance to being tracked, sometimes has led to, ever more unobtrusive methods of getting to the same end by powerful agencies, whether state or corporate, in American society. So they haven't necessarily been 100% victories, but they have been important in steering the discussion. And you asked about prospects for today, and I do think our moment, as far as I can tell, is one in which there's a pretty strong and sincere effort to grapple with questions around information privacy, around databases, commercial and state, about data mining, in a way that I think it's not unprecedented, but I think there's a kind of collection around these issues that has been made more urgent by a number of scandals recently that I think may eventuate in some really important political pressure on the institutions that are supposed to be monitoring these things and watching out for privacy. So watchdog agencies, of course, but the Congress and the Facebook hearings and other things. So I don't think we're at the end of that story, but I think public pressure does make a real difference, and the public sensibilities that underlie them are really, really critical to whatever is going to come next.
Sandra, Shoshana, anything from our remote audience for Professor Igo? I've got a closing question for her before we let her go, but want to make sure we bring you guys in. Shoshana.
I do have a question. Actually, I have many, but I'll leave the rest of them aside because this one sort of just came up. So one of the things that was interesting is, from your vantage point, having been so mired in this from a historical perspective, what you just mentioned, right, crystallizes something that it runs throughout our awareness as we read through this in the modern age and as it starts to evolve, which is that people tend to be, and I wonder if this is a strictly American mentality, people tend to be willing to exchange something, right? So this notion that we're willing to give to a computer, to a company, what we won't give to the government, right? We en masse will work against giving certain things over when we feel that we're being controlled in a way that we haven't decided to be controlled, or by something we haven't decided to get something back from that we appreciate. And I just wonder if there's anything else informing that vantage point, or if it's that you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you just expressed very well a sense that we have that may be more a product of our present than of the past, of an acknowledged transaction that's happening, right? That we're giving away something to get something. And that's often trivialized, I think, when people talk about the convenience that we get, by having an easy pass or something like that. But it's not actually trivial. It's really something much bigger than we usually recognize, and it's sort of what the structure of the society is that we live in and what makes it go. And as American society has really turned into an information society, I would say a knowing society, one that really operates very much based on what it knows about its own citizens or its own people. We have had to contend again and again with what that boundary ought to be. What should we not know? What should not be known about us? And how could you enforce that if you wanted to, right? So I think those are questions that we maybe are recognizing more clearly now, even if they have a longer lineage, and that are becoming inescapable, maybe in a way, in a fully networked, sort of every direction society that we live in now. I do think that our contemporary ideas about privacy have a lot to do with that transactional kind of nature that you mentioned. I think they also, maybe because of a recognition that we are so well known in all these different domains, I do think we have our language around privacy has shifted a little toward anonymity, so people trying to protect themselves from all of these knowers and watchers in the society. And I think that's been an interesting and pretty recent development, actually. That's not how people used to talk about privacy, I don't think. And I think it really is a product of quite recent developments in this sense that we're in this inescapable net of watchers and observers, some of whom we know about, many of whom we don't.
Professor, thank you so much. Quick closing. Are you writing something in the tech? Did you get hooked on this topic? Can we expect something that builds on this next? Or are you turning back to other interesting areas of your scholarship in history?
Well, thanks. I am working on a couple of different things. I've really become, I think through this project, become really interested in the multiple histories of data and how people live with data and how data kind of enters everyday life and becomes part of people's biographies and so forth. So that's one project. But I really did get hooked on the Social Security number. And so the next project I'm really thinking about now is a biography of the Social Security number from beginning to end, and thinking about how that number kind of manifests itself in our lives in all kinds of ways through the present.
Wow, phenomenal. That'll be exciting. I imagine there'll be a place in there for Alessandro Acquisti's work showing that he could actually figure out your Social Security number, some historical records and some smart thinking. Thanks so much for joining us. We had about 53 remote people, and we'll now talk about you and about the book amongst the group. So hopefully we sold a couple of them, and it was money well spent. I was a little bit relieved when I realized that a lot of it was footnotes.
You're not the first person who said that.
I didn't want more, but I didn't want to finish so that I could feel like I had accomplished it. But actually, there were a couple of great sources that, frankly, I found actually useful further additional reading. So thanks so much for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you at future privacy conferences, and look forward to your future work. So,
thanks so much again for the invitation. I appreciate it.
And now what I've been curious about, since we talked a little bit about the Social Security number and some uniquely US history, so those of you from across the Atlantic, maybe let me start in the room, and then we'll turn to Sandra for the French perspective, where perhaps the Yellow Jackets are trying to show that there are social movements that drive change. I guess we'll see what that comes to. But for the London crew, did this seem remote? And I certainly would love to read sort of a history of privacy in the UK or Europe, but it would feel a little different than my Social Security number. I've got a Social Security number. What was your? Let me turn to Gabe first. How did you look at it as, well, you're originally American. All right, let me start with the, right?
Originally Canadian, but.
Canadian, all right, well then
I have a bit of both.
You qualify as a non-US.
That's what we all say.
We used to consider the Canadians part of America. We're at war now somehow with the current.
We fought in 1812 too.
It sounds like, think the relationships could be better. The people are connected. It seems like there's some current government issues. Anyway, what was your perspective?
So maybe not surprising for those of you on this call, but perhaps more surprising for the broader narrative is just how rich the history of privacy is here in the US. A lot of us know about Warren and Brandeis. We know about the famous Supreme Court cases in the 60s, but seeing kind of the space in between those and how rich those privacy debates were, I think would reverse what popular conceptions are, certainly in Europe, around America being a place where privacy doesn't exist. And the other thing that struck me, looking at this as someone who's been doing a lot of GDPR, which is maybe evidence of Stockholm Syndrome, because I was issue spotting in here. Where does the GDPR play a role? Where does it not? And the thing I found really interesting was how few of these issues the GDPR would actually solve, how data protection is sort of a narrow slice of a much broader privacy picture. So you start with Warren and Brandeis, not really a data protection issue. Social security numbers, there's a big debate about whether it should be on paper or a dog tag. The GDPR has nothing to say about that. There was a really interesting case. They talked about whether public buses can play music and force people to listen to that. And that went to the Supreme Court. There was no constitutional right not to hear music on the bus, but a few justices actually dissented from that. So it struck me as interesting just how many of these issues would not be framed in terms of data protection. And it made me think, in the last year, we've seen a lot of very favorable coverage of the GDPR here in the US. Some of it sort of looking to the EU as having solved privacy. And it makes you think maybe it solved data protection in some ways, but there are much broader issues that don't even get touched by GDPR. The professor's reference to Cambridge Analytica, I think, was a really good one. GDPR can be helpful in some aspects of the types of issues that came out through Cambridge Analytica, but it doesn't really give us the tools to fundamentally solve all the things that I think people struggle with.
When I leave Brussels and I'm forced to go through that commercial space and I'm assailed by the perfumes, I continually, I'm usually leaving like a privacy conference, I think of, is there some angle somehow where this ought to be an infringement on my rights, A, to kind of be forced to go through the shop, but B, to kind of get all these multiple smells coming at me. Anyway, Guy, and then to Sandra, your reaction from, were you born, did you grow up in London? Are you born and bred?
Yes, London and born and bred, yeah. I loved it. I thought it was a great book. I thought it had a fantastic richness. And I think one of the things that maybe meant it transferred well was it really showed, talk a lot about how privacy touched so many angles of our life, but it really laid that out and went through them each in turn at different stages of history. And I think so many of those things are common, not just across the Atlantic, but also in time. I mean, Sarah mentioned the SSN and the background to that, and I loved the bit about the sort of fake news put out by the opposition party ahead of it, where they're sort of saying, oh, it's going to be these things, this is what all the data they'll capture, and that sort of stuff. Well, these are very real problems today. It's lovely to see that they're not new in that way. And also the right to research. I thought that was a really interesting parallel in the Humphreys case, where they're sort of talking about, well, what's right to research? I think we see that now with Article 89, this sort of trying to balance that right to research versus your rights to privacy under public interest. So I thought a lot of it really transcended geography and time to a certain extent. There were a couple of things that I sort of, that it made me ponder. And really the main one was, whilst so many things seemed similar and familiar in different ways, the one thing that seemed staunchly different perhaps today was the asymmetry of information. That in the past cases, you often saw, whether it was justices, whether it was general people, having a decent understanding of what it was that was being done. that there seemed to be some ability to understand what we would now say data controllers were doing with the data, which just seems so absent today, that wasn't one of the things that seemed true, that seemed the same as we have now, that many people could understand in a real way what the privacy issue was when someone was saying, oh, there's a policeman under your bed, or someone saying, oh, this person was monitoring the tea rooms. Whereas today, I'm not sure people really have a sense of what the cookie trackers are doing when you log onto a website and how it's being passed between one to another. And so for me, the known citizen, I thought was an excellent title as well. And made me think, is the gap the known controller? Is it that we don't have a good enough understanding of what's happening there to allow us to have these debates? Because you really saw through each new debate privacy evolving and the rights evolving too, and the sort of difficulty of the justices going, well, that's not really what it meant before, but we do think there should be something here and something new coming in. And I think we need to keep doing that, but to do that, we need to have an understanding of the problem. And I think that's something that lacks from the public dialogue. It made me think also of the OII, Sandra Rochter. I don't know if you follow her work at the OII, but her work, recent paper on the right to reasonable inferences. And again, that's sort of the idea of a sort of evolving privacy rights that require us to understand what is being done there, the risk of unjustifiable or poorly considered inferences and the impact they may have. So yeah, thought it was fascinating, thought it transferred very well from geography and history, and yeah, made me ponder some interesting questions.
Your reference to the policeman under the bed reminds me of the flap. Was it just a couple of days ago on Twitter, people were sharing, I guess it was Sleepy's, one of the big mattress brands, evidently comes with some sort of sensors that help report how you slept, how long you slept, how deep you slept, which is all very interesting, but it also collects audio so that it can report whether you've snored, which, you know, is of interest. But I was just thinking, it captures audio under your mattress? That's a little bit frightening. Sandra, how did this play for for somebody from France? How did it play in Paris?
It was really an amazing book, I think, from a French point of view, because I discovered a lot of things, of facts I didn't ever heard about. Of course, the social security number. I didn't know all the discussion about it. For France, it was very different because our social security number is coming from just during the war. In 1940, it was a General Camille, who decided to try to reconstitute the French army, demobilized in 1940. So he created this number. So we don't have at all the same history. So for me, it was great to discover all these facts. I discovered that the Kardashians are not at the beginning of reality TV. I didn't know that. I discovered the Loud family. So I was, wow, okay, this is interesting. No, the fact that, of course, I found the most interesting for me, and I'm not sure it's because I'm French. It's I'm a lawyer and I'm dealing all day long about data protection, data privacy, data and technology, and it was very humbling experience to be aware. Oh, okay. Privacy is not only about data. Okay, it's also about the patient in an hospital, and it's also about architecture, and it's also about a lot of subjects I've never thought about. So I was, wow, okay. So it was very interesting for me. So it's not really about the French part, but more I'm too much a lawyer, and I need to think about other subjects. So I understand your concern about the perfume in the airport. I have often the same. And yes, of course, this is also privacy. So the fact interesting, it's during the read, I never thought about GDPR. I never thought about that. I was only thinking, okay, this is really interesting because so many points. And the fact interesting, it's I don't think we did done we didn't discuss it yet. It's sometimes, as a lawyer, I'm always focusing about protecting the privacy. And in this book, there is a part about, no, sometimes we need to be known. And the part about the gay movement was really interesting. The validation of being named and seen, and the fight not to have to be private. It was really interesting to think about that on a philosophical level. So it was really, for me, a great book. And the last point for me was about my biggest fear about privacy. In the chapter about the power's psyche and the example about motivational research used as an alibi, the protests were not about the methods, but the fact that you can be changed by being known. It's not only you are being known, but you can be changed, and this could harm you. And this is my fear as a professional, is how now we are using technologies and making sometimes people change and not knowing that they are changing because of the use of the data. In the previous book, the author, I forgot his name, talk about the fact of course, privacy by design, and the fact that sometimes you can force people in doing things they are not even thinking about it. So this part about motivational research was really, really interesting. And maybe the last point was, okay, I'm French, and we don't have at all the same history about privacy. The subject, we have our own scandals, we have our own issues, but they are not the same. And I was thinking, okay, so history at the origin of our values, or is it the opposite? Is it our values making our history? So I don't have an answer. If someone has the answer, I'm really interested about it. But this was really my big question. Okay, this is really different, and how can I explain the differences?
Stacey, and maybe any of the other women, she kept coming back to multiple times, sort of women in privacy and feminism in privacy, and privacy being used, in a way that constrains. It was the man's privacy to keep his woman private, and how that was, obviously not a liberating idea. What were your reactions to her discussions about feminism and privacy, and how privacy has been a factor for women's issues over the years?
That was absolutely an important thread, and not only privacy of men, but in a couple of instances, privacy of the marital institution, of a specific kind of marital institution, to be specific. Yeah, I actually thought that Professor Igo's discussion of Griswold versus Connecticut, and also the following cases and that whole time period of cultural shifts around the notion of privacy was particularly interesting, because in part because it's always seemed a little strange to me for reproductive rights to be grounded in a right to privacy. And I think she does a good job both of showing that those cases were a result of a political movement which had sort of opened a constitutional window for the new constitutional rights that were being created, and in showing that it might be inherently unsteady to base reproductive rights in a right to privacy, right? Because there's so much flexibility in its definition, there's so much flexibility in how people interpret it. And so it would be really interesting to ask her what she might speculate for the future, now that we see that potentially Roe versus Wade might be under threat, and maybe the claim is that you abandon the effort and we need an equal rights amendment or something else, right? Or maybe the claim is just that, or by which I mean that privacy is always going to be an inherently unsteady ground on which to base jurisprudence, and maybe it means the opposite, that you just need to continue that political momentum. So it was very interesting.
Yeah, I see Shoshana. Let me
Yeah,
bring her in and we'll come to
Oh, no.
Katie.
No, we can stay on that topic. I just didn't want to forget something. So please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So on this,
It felt uniquely American to me too.
Yeah.
I'd be really interested in others' views on that, but uniquely American.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, especially in the memoir culture topic. I think stories of ourselves. I found that like most interesting of this, like opening up of oneself in order not only to normalize but also share and find kind of like a tribe. But I thought a missing corollary was the fact that women are increasingly surveilled online, in part because we're the prime consumers, right? Mm-hmm. Like our employment for STEM fields and our purchasing power is hugely attractive in the ad tech arena. And I thought that was an interesting missing corollary.
That's true. We actually just saw a case from a couple of weeks ago about, well, not a case, I'm sorry, actually a very, very good New York Times expose about how difficult it is for pregnant women to remove themselves from the audience categories that have been created about them after they have, for instance, lost a pregnancy. They'll continue to get advertisements targeted to pregnant women or to new mothers for a long time despite their efforts.
Do you know there's actually a special list that is used by one of the big marketing groups to suppress that? They actually buy, to the extent that they have, you know, something that shows up on a death record. Obviously, an early miscarriage, you know, it may not be reflected there, but obviously there are infants who die, you know, fairly soon. And one of the major marketing groups keeps what's known as the dead babies list, which they distribute so that you stop getting, you know, those very troubling things. And it came up, I didn't know about it and was at an FTC program once, and, you know, somebody brought up this issue and the marketing group said, oh no, we take care of that with the dead babies list. Everybody in the room was like, what? But there is such a thing, and I guess it's motivated from the right place. Anyway, Shoshana.
Sorry, I just, because the book made me want to talk to everyone, but I'll try to keep it concise. So essentially, I wanted to echo the notion that I thought that the prism through which this took us, the sort of privacy versus convenience versus greater good versus social services, was tremendous. And when it hones down to a point, there are a couple things that kept arising, and actually Sandra touched on part of it, right? Is one, and when we were talking to the professor, she was saying, you know, this is a relatively new concept of exchanging things, but from a standpoint of inclusion, right, which is this ongoing thing that we still have to do to big parts of the world and give this identity, and what we lose by assuming the identity that's given to us and aligning ourselves, though perhaps not tattooing it on our arms volitionally. One of the things is Sandra's concern of, to what extent does our alliance and our allegiance to, whether it's the psychological testing we take voluntarily now, or the psychological, you know, just these little tests on the internet, or the bigger well-known tests that we take for corporate purposes, to what extent does that change us and we align ourselves with what we're being told and what's being reinforced from motivational research and all of this, the feedback loop of this information, whether from its beginning with simply handing someone an ID card or putting their identity on blockchain in the middle of a jungle somewhere. How does that shift us, and what do we lose that we're not even conceiving of? And I think the book touched on that philosophical question without hitting it in that way, and I thought Sandra brought a good point up.
Folks in the virtual space, we'll pop you up on video so you can be on the game show as well if you raise your hand. Our friend Tara points out that Fitbit could tell your employer you are pregnant probably before even you know it. Quite reminds me, there are services that seek to help employers predict the number of people who may be pregnant so they can, you know, maybe plan accordingly, or who might be leaving. And, you know, they argue they're not dealing with anybody's individual information to deal with you or discriminate or whatever it is, but that they want to give you intelligence by mining all of that. And obviously it's been controversial because you really need to trust that it's not going to be used in an adversarial way, but you can imagine that Fitbit knows how often you're having sex and how often, but maybe also whether you're coming down with Parkinson's disease, and should they be, since they have the ability to analyze these algorithms and maybe tie them to, you know, any ailment that might be coming on, you know, should they be telling you? There was a cardiac doctor who did some work with Bing search data, and he showed that he could predict based on people's searches. It wasn't cardiac; it was a different kind of. But he could help detect whether or not someone might have pancreatic cancer, which is very hard to detect, and you don't know often until it's too late. But people were searching some number, back pain and a few other things that were correlated, and he showed that he could, in some cases, alert you. But can you imagine doing some searches and then like getting a pop-up, like based on your last 3 months of searches, you might be at medical risk. We suggest you seek, visit your doctor and alert them that you have indicated these potential symptoms. On one hand, that could be incredibly freaky and obviously wrong, but in some instances, it might actually be life-saving. So the research ethics of, what should Fitbit be doing with the data it is sitting on? Should it just be like, hey, I just want to sell these things? Or should it be studying whether or not these correlations are useful or not? I don't know. Anyway, do we have anybody from the floor?
Well, you've got a great point from Gabriella. Gabriella Zanfir-Fortuna is our policy counsel focusing on EU efforts. So this might be of interest. She points out that the right to a healthy environment was developed by the European Court of Human Rights under its jurisprudence on Article 8, the right to respect for private life. Given that the convention doesn't enshrine a specific right on protecting the environment. So a right to a healthy environment could play into not smelling a perfume.
But Gabriella, I'm definitely going to use that on the perfume side. But is Gabriella saying that the notion of sort of abortion coming in as a privacy right in the U.S., that the environment is being brought in through the right to the right to respect a private life? I don't. There is no environmental.
Yeah, no, I don't know that was the point, Gabrielle. You'll have to jump in here if you're able to via chat. But no, I think it was maybe a point on the earlier comment about not being subjected to smells or unwanted attention.
I will tell you that despite the smells, there also are these Juuls products labeled Juuls, and I'm fascinated because growing up in the U.S., when other kids could get, Sam and Bob on their license plates, their little, for their bicycles or stickers or keychains, the 30 or 40 common names, there was never a Juul. So the idea that there it is in Brussels, so I always stop to take a picture. So I actually don't mind the smells that much.
So Janelle, who might join us, we'll put the offer out there from Boulder, says, let's talk about the future. This book puts privacy in a good light. Is there a way we can use lessons from the past to help us frame the benefits of privacy better today?
Well, I was struck by the FERPA, for those who aren't familiar with the federal student privacy law, or schools are regulated primarily at the very local level in the U.S. This is a federal law that allows the Department of Education, which does a lot of funding of the schools, although it can't very specifically regulate them, to withhold funding from schools that don't follow a very specific set of privacy rules. And in her discussion there, she really shows how FERPA was a reaction to, activities that were happening in the schools at the time, whether it was research or law enforcement. And we've just lived through the last couple of years. There have been 30, 40 state laws passed to regulate further around student privacy. And many of those, again, were driven not really by traditional student privacy, what's happening to their data, as much as by, is there too much testing? Is data going to be used to fire teachers because it will show that the schools aren't performing well and other teachers going to be blamed? It was a sort of a host of, some people didn't like the Common Core curriculum and testing, and it's sort of all gotten, or too much time in front of screens, or is personalized learning, sort of a whole bunch of obviously data related issues that, where privacy law ended up being sort of the solution. So I think, that was a history repeat. It just was, wow, here we are with another wave, of reaction. I'd argue, I wonder what you'll all say to this. Somebody the other day said to me, a very prominent machine learning expert, people don't argue about electricity anymore, right? And obviously that enabled all kinds of things. Like that's just, now we argue about, is the machine right? And so all these discussions we have today about machine learning, he says they're going to be naive because that's what code is going to do, right? Programs are going to improve and be more accurate. And we will be arguing not about machine learning, but we'll be arguing about the tools and the mechanisms and so forth. And I'd argue that we're going to be discussing less GDPR and less sort of data protection, but rather, should your car, to save your life, pull over, penalize you for speeding, alert the authorities that you've looked away from the road, to save you, to save others around you? Well, the ethics, right? Is it too Orwellian, or do the ethics, overwhelm? Should Fitbit, call you if you look like you're, going to commit suicide in 2 minutes? Your hands are, or there's an assault going on. Someone call the police because, right? I mean, some of these things seem Orwellian, but in other places we're debating, the right balance. And so it maybe won't be a technology discussion as much as it's going to be, do we actually like these ethics? Do we like this discrimination? And now we talk about technology and Facebook, but maybe in 10 years, we're actually going to turn to the issue as opposed to the underlying technology. Am I being too?
Well, one of my takeaways reading it, which I think is maybe both optimistic and pessimistic about the future of privacy, we haven't solved any of the issues that occur in the book. In fact, you start in the 1890s, and then we move to the 1930s, and we move to the 60s, and then the 70s and the 80s, and in each decade, we add a new layer of privacy problems, each of which we end up carrying with us in kind of our backpack, and we don't ever really solve them. And I think that's sort of optimistic, because running through notions of privacy law and what a lot of us do every day is this concern that if societal expectations are changing, then your viewpoint at any one time is sort of meaningless. You're actually just halting progress rather than advancing anything useful. And so the optimistic note I have here is actually it seems that while maybe expectations change, the values behind them don't, and we wrestle with those same issues for eternity. We just add more issues to the list. But maybe that's also pessimistic because it means we never resolve anything.
Yeah, maybe I'm a product of my time, but I did really like where the last chapter ended up, which was all about how privacy was more about self-determination and self-expression rather than hiding something. And there's a couple times throughout that chapter where I was like, yeah, privacy does not equal secrecy. Like, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can just be selective. And so I think that, like, going forward, maybe the issue of our time will be self-determination or the right to be yourself without undue infringement. But I do think that we're in a scenario here that many of the characters in this book weren't at the time of. We have tech that's going a little bit faster than problems that are arising, right? Telephone arose around the time where you couldn't speak to someone. This is a great transformation. Same thing with the Social Security numbers. It solved an emerging problem because we wanted to offer benefits. Algorithmic bias, decision-making and all the rest, I think, are proceeding at too quick of a pace for us to account for the bias issues and also what kind of information should be used and how these systems should be built. And so I'm a little reticent for us to move forward in the voice of innovation and transformation in the tech world without first thinking about the individual.
As a consumer advocate, what was your first sort of question, sort of, well, did you see consumer movements or, civil movements, making a real difference? What's your take? It seems like we keep saying, well, the next big, terrible thing would really make a difference. And we've had every data breach and just every, embarrassing thing you can imagine seems to have happened. And that doesn't seem to be what has created a tide of legislative effort. It seems that it's strong law in California that's now convincing. Do you have hope because you sort of see the scope of history that there is people rising up opportunity? Will privacy be an issue? I've worked on a couple of presidential campaigns, and I always get excited and we draft some papers, and then the first debate comes up, and I'm like, can we brief the candidates? And then they're like, this is not going to be a question. Will data protection, privacy, you think sort of be an issue that candidates are debating, or something that there's really a movement around outside of our circles? Well,
I, like Janelle, also really kind of wanted to ask Sarah or Professor Igo, kind of as a oracle of what she thinks should come next, because that was the question I was left with. And I'm also trying to deal with where the next move will be. But I think the guy hit the nail on the head early on in the conversation, saying that there's just too many controllers. And that's part of the problem is in this history that we have here in this book, you have one controller or one body that you can kind of rally behind. Even if it was a bunch of different school districts, you were able to kind of create a movement. And I think now we're not really seeing that. And also the benefits and risks are so disparate. It's hard to have communal action put together. But I think that there's got to be, as we've increasingly used tech to make life easier, I think there's also has to be a downtrend where we're going to see the full capacity that tech has given us and then possibly a drop off of use. But I don't know. That's just speaking from a point of view, especially as we connect more and more devices, to what end, I'm not sure. I think there has to be some sort of drop off.
Guy, were you looking to say a final word, and then we'll close?
One of the things many comments made me think about is a great book on inventing the individual as a history of sort of Western liberalism and the rise of the individual. And I'd love to
inventing the individual.
Yeah, and I can't remember the author's name now, but I'd love to have charted some of these changes against that, because I think so many of them, the concept of privacy relates to what we consider the bounds of our individual self. And when you look back 100 years, and it is the family unit, you have very different concepts, even if the invasions are similar and driven by the same technological changes. And I wonder what the trajectory of individualism means for some of these debates if they do map to one another in that way.
Quite a good thought to end on.
Yes.
We will send out a collection if you have some ideas, a book on your shelf that you'd like to chat about. Please ping us. We've got a collection that we're interested in. I just bought a great book, interviews with like the 20 leading AI machine learning experts, asking them, what they think, and it's really condensed and nicely written. So I'll plug that one, but it's up to all of you, and then we'll poll, and hopefully, Michelle, February, January, when will we'll try to give people like 2 months or so to read. So we'll toss out a date. When? February? We'll toss out a date in February. Thanks to all of you who joined. We had 50 some odd at some point. Thanks, Stacy, Michelle, for making it happen. Our remote speakers, thank you, Sandra Azaria in Paris, Shoshana Rosenberg in New York, Professor Igo, thanks for the tremendous publication, and Guy and Katie and our team here in the room. Thank you. See you all.
Thank you
Happy
all.
holidays.
Goodbye.
Happy holidays.